In our previous lecture, we talked about different types of speeches to persuade. Today, we want to talk about the methods of persuasion, how you can be more persuasive to your listeners, how you can persuade them to agree or believe in your argument. One of the chief things that makes you more persuasive to an audience is a sense of credibility, a sense that the audience believes that you are a person worth listening to, that you're a person who knows what they're talking about. Now, there are two things that affect credibility. Those two factors are your character and your competence. When we say character, we are referring to how the audience perceives you as a person. Are you a person who is trustworthy? Are you a person who inspires confidence? The second factor is your perceived competence. Do you know what you're talking about? And for you to be as persuasive as you can be, the audience has to see you as a person who understands and has a degree of mastery of the topic being considered. For the speaker, there are three types of credibility, three different ways credibility can be expressed, and it's important to understand the differences in these. These three types of credibility include initial credibility, derived credibility, and terminal credibility. We'll start by talking about the first, initial credibility. Initial credibility is the opinion the audience develops of you as the speaker before you even begin to speak. They're going to make a certain amount of judgment by the way you walk to the podium, by the way you're dressed, by your physical demeanor. They will make some assumptions about who you are. And all of these are controllable. We can dress in such a way, we can carry ourselves in such a way to make those judgments the audience makes in their assessment of initial credibility positive. You need to dress in a professional manner. You need to carry yourself with confidence, and you need to stand at the lectern, the podium, make eye contact with your audience, and give an appearance of confidence and truthfulness and sincerity. Derived credibility is the change in your credibility, either positively or negatively, that occurs because of what you say during the course of your speech. Up until you speak, the audience is judging a book by its cover. And just like book companies go to great efforts to make that book look appealing, you need to go to great efforts to make that outside appearance good. But what they're ultimately going to base their judgment of credibility on are the words that come out of your mouth. And so you need to make sure that your derived credibility is as strong and as positive as it can be. You do that by knowing your material thoroughly. You do that by basing your theories, your argument on sound sources, sound information, and finally, your arguments should be based on sound reasoning. If you do all of that, plus maintain that sense of honesty and sincerity that you've developed when you came to the podium, you should have a strong level of derived credibility at the end of your speech. Which brings us to the third type of credibility, terminal credibility. Terminal credibility is the credibility the audience has in you as the speaker at the end of your speech. Terminal credibility equals initial credibility plus derived credibility. And it's the most important. What's most important is how they see you at the end of your speech. After you have completed what you've had to say, what are they going to carry away with them? That's what becomes the bottom line. How can you make the most of this credibility or enhance your credibility? That's what we want to talk about now. Techniques, methods you can use to appear more credible to your audience. The first thing you need to do is explain your competence to the audience. Tell them how or why you are qualified to talk on the subject that you're speaking
This
to.
will typically be done in the introduction, but you need to do it throughout the speech. You need to remind them constantly that you are qualified to talk about what you're addressing. But the first statement of credibility, that first statement of competence, should come in your introduction, where, as we talked about earlier, you are establishing credibility and goodwill.
The next thing you need to do is establish common ground with your audience.
By the very nature of what this speech is, a persuasive speech, you should be talking to people who are not going to necessarily be in agreement with you. They're going to be opposed or dubious about your argument. And so it's important to establish that sense of goodwill and common ground, that they see that you are a person of like values, that you are a person who seeks an amicable solution.
Finally, one of the most important things you do to enhance your credibility is to deliver your speech with fluency and conviction. You need to sound like you know what you're doing, and you need to sound like you're passionate about it.
Above all the other factors, this speaking with fluency, this speaking with conviction, will give you a sense of credibility with your audience that will allow you to have impact on the way they think and the way they behave.
The strength of your argument is also going to be influenced by the types and the quality of the evidence you use to support it.
What exactly is evidence? I mean, we hear that term all the time. We watch dramas on television and in the movies that are stories of trials and court cases. We hear about evidence on shows like Nancy Grace, but what exactly is it? Evidence is simply the materials you use to support the argument that you're making in your speech.
First, the evidence you use should be specific.
Whatever type of evidence you're using, whether that's statistics, examples, testimony, that evidence should be specific. Now, if you said untreated mental illness costs our country lots of money every year, that's not very effective as an argument. That's not very convincing. But if you can say, according to the American Health Association, untreated mental illness in the United States costs our country $200 million every year, that's a specific argument, and that's much more convincing to an audience.
You also need to make sure that the evidence you're using is novel, it's new, it's not something the audience has heard over and over again.
If you're using the same old tired evidence that your audience has heard again and again, it hasn't been strong enough to change their view before. What makes you think that that same old evidence is going to have that effect now? You need to use evidence that they have not heard before, that is new, that is novel, that's going to have fresh impact.
The evidence you're using needs to be credible. It needs to come from credible sources.
Your sources need to be non-biased. I mean, if you're doing a speech in favor of the Second Amendment, the NRA is not a credible source. They are an organization devoted to making sure that people can have as many guns as they want. And so to use them as a source is not credible. Whether it's a liberal cause, whether it's a conservative cause, your sources need to be clearly unbiased. The NRA is a biased source when it comes to arguments about guns. Fox News is a biased source when it comes to conservative causes or opposition to liberal causes. MSNBC is a biased source when it comes to liberal issues or criticizing or opposing conservative ones. You need to make sure that whatever source you use, it is credible and unbiased.
Finally, you need to make sure that the point of your evidence is clear. I don't know how many times I've seen speeches that use evidence, but the evidence is not explained. They don't tell me why this proves their point.
So, to summarize, today we've talked about credibility. We've talked about the types of credibility: initial credibility, derived credibility, terminal credibility, and we've talked about the factors that contribute to credibility: your character and your competence. We've talked about ways that you can enhance your credibility by telling us why you are competent to speak on a subject, by developing common ground with your audience, and by delivering your speech with fluency and conviction. And finally, we talked about ways to use evidence, and we talked about the use of novel evidence. We talked about the use of specific evidence. We talked about the use of credible evidence. And finally, we talked about the importance of explaining why your evidence is supporting your argument, why it says what you say it's saying. All right, in our next lecture, we're going to look at methods of reasoning and fallacies that often occur in our reasoning techniques. Thanks, guys.